In the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow, there was a legend that few dared to speak of. The older generation, those with skin as wrinkled as the pages of an ancient tome, whispered of a time when the town was not yet cursed. But now, the younger ones had all but left, and those who remained lived in fear. Fear of the midnight whistle. The town itself seemed to be decaying, as if the very ground it stood on was rotting from beneath. The buildings leaned at odd angles, their wooden frames groaning under the weight of time and neglect. Vines, thick and thorny, crawled up the walls like the twisted fingers of the dead, eager to pull the town into the earth. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and mold, and the sky was always a sickly gray, as if the sun had long since given up on this forsaken place. It was said that at the stroke of midnight, a single, eerie whistle would pierce the silence of Black Hollow. It wasn't a melody anyone could recognize, more like the mournful cry of a long-forgotten soul, wrenched from the depths of some unspeakable abyss. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the empty streets, reverberating off the crumbling walls and seeping into the very marrow of those who heard it. No one knew where the whistle came from, but everyone knew what it meant. If you heard the whistle, you had to stay inside, lock your doors, and pray that it didn't come for you. Because once the whistle stopped, the hunt began. The legend spoke of a figure, a twisted, nightmarish thing that emerged from the shadows once the whistle ceased. No one had ever seen it and lived to tell the tale, but the stories painted a picture so vivid, so grotesque, that it haunted the dreams of even the bravest souls. They spoke of eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness, of a mouth twisted into a permanent sneer, dripping with the blood of those unfortunate enough to cross its path. It was neither man nor beast, but something in between. Something that should not exist, yet did. The figure was said to be the remnants of a man who had once lived in Black Hollow, centuries ago, when the town was still alive. He had been a cruel man, feared and hated by all who knew him. His cruelty knew no bounds, and he delighted in the suffering of others. But his reign of terror came to an end when the townsfolk, driven to desperation, banded together and put an end to his life in the most gruesome way they could imagine. They hanged him from the tallest tree in the town square, and as his body swung lifelessly in the wind, they set his house ablaze, hoping to rid themselves of his evil once and for all. But some things are not so easily vanquished. As the flames consumed his home, a terrible scream echoed through the night, a scream that was soon drowned out by the shrill, piercing sound of a whistle. The townsfolk covered their ears, but the sound was relentless, worming its way into their minds and leaving them with a sense of dread that would never truly fade. When the fire finally died down, and the ashes of the man's house were all that remained, they found something that chilled them to the bone. There, in the center of the charred remains, was a whistle, small, silver, and untouched by the flames. No one dared to touch it, and so it was left to rot with the rest of the house. But the whistle had other plans. Years passed, and the town of Black Hollow fell into ruin. The once thriving community dwindled until only a handful of souls remained, clinging to the remnants of their former lives. The legend of the midnight whistle became just that, a legend, a story to scare children into behaving. But on the anniversary of the man's death, the whistle would sound once more, a reminder of the darkness that still lingered in Black Hollow. And now, as the clock in the town square ticked closer to midnight, the few remaining residents of Black Hollow huddled in their homes, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew what was coming, and they knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. The air was thick with anticipation, and the silence was deafening. Then, it began. A soft, almost melodic whistle, drifting through the night like the call of a siren. It was beautiful in a way, haunting and sad, but there was something underneath it, a darkness, a promise of pain and suffering that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. As the whistle grew louder, the shadows in the town seemed to shift and move, as if something was stirring within them. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring the streets and turning the once familiar town into a labyrinth of shadows and fear. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating in its intensity. Not a single sound could be heard. No wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then, from the darkness, it emerged. A figure, tall and impossibly thin. Its limbs elongated and twisted in ways that defied nature. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its eyes were hollow pits, glowing with a faint, sickly light that seemed to pierce the soul of anyone who dared to look into them. Its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with jagged, yellow teeth, and from its throat came a low, guttural growl that sent waves of terror through the hearts of those who heard it. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, gliding through the fog like a wraith. It made no sound as it approached the first house. Its eyes locked on the door with a hunger that was palpable. Inside, the occupants cowered, clutching each other in the darkness, praying that it would pass them by. But it did not. The figure reached out with one long, clawed hand, and with a single, effortless motion, it tore the door from its hinges, sending it crashing to the ground. The occupants screamed, but it was too late. The figure was upon them in an instant, its teeth sinking into flesh, ripping and tearing with a ferocity that was almost animalistic. The screams were short-lived, cut off by the sickening sound of bones snapping and flesh being torn from the bone. When the figure was done, it stood over the remains of its victims, its mouth dripping with blood, its eyes glowing with a malevolent satisfaction. It let out a low, rumbling growl, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the fog that now covered the town like a shroud. The residents of Black Hollow knew that this was only the beginning. The whistle had sounded, and now the hunt was on. No one was safe, and there was nowhere to hide. The figure would continue its rampage until it had claimed its due, and when it was finished, Black Hollow would be left to rot, just like the man who had cursed it all those years ago. And so, as the fog rolled in and the shadows grew longer, the town of Black Hollow waited, their hearts pounding in their chests, knowing that the whistle would sound again, and the figure would come for them all. The whistle's cry faded into the night, leaving behind a silence so thick it felt as if the town itself was holding its breath. The fog swirled through the streets, now a living entity, its tendrils creeping into every crevice, every shadow, hiding the horror that lurked within. Inside one of the decrepit houses, a lone figure stood at the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. His name was Jacob, one of the few who had been too stubborn, or too afraid, to leave Black Hollow. He was a man worn down by time, his face lined with the weight of years spent in a town that was slowly dying around him. His eyes, once bright with the hope of youth, were now dulled by the knowledge of what was to come. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Black Hollow had. But until tonight, they had been just that, stories. Something to scare the children, to keep them in line. But now, as the whistle echoed in his ears and the fog pressed against his windows like some suffocating force, he knew the truth. The stories were real, and the horror they described was no mere figment of imagination. Jacob's hands trembled as he reached for the lock on his door, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no illusions about what was coming. He knew that the figure in the fog would find him, just as it had found countless others before him. But still, he clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could survive the night. He turned away from the window, his eyes scanning the small, cluttered room that had been his home for as long as he could remember. The walls were lined with old, yellowed photographs, ghosts of a time when Black Hollow had been alive, when there had been laughter in the streets and light in the windows. Now, the photographs were the only reminders of that time, and even they were fading, just like everything else in this cursed town. Jacob moved to the fireplace, where a small fire still crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of an old hunting rifle that leaned against the hearth. It had been his father's, passed down to him when the old man had died, taken by the same curse that now haunted the town. Jacob had never had much use for it. There was nothing left to hunt in Black Hollow, But tonight, he felt a strange sense of comfort in its presence. He picked up the rifle, his hands shaking as he checked the chamber. It was loaded, though he doubted it would do much good against whatever was out there. Still, it was better than nothing. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and turned back to the door, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would do when the figure came for him. He had no plan, no strategy, just a desperate need to survive. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant, ominous growl that seemed to be growing closer with each passing second. Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the walls themselves to come alive and swallow him whole. And then, just as the tension became unbearable, there was a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible creak of wood coming from somewhere deep within the house. Jacob froze, his heart skipping a beat. He knew every sound this house made, every creak and groan of its old bones. But this was different. This was the sound of something moving, something that should not be there. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his knuckles white with fear. The sound came again, louder this time, and closer. It was coming from the hallway, just beyond the door to the room he was in. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the door, willing it to stay shut, to keep whatever was out there from getting in. But the door did not stay shut. With a slow, deliberate motion, the handle began to turn, the ancient mechanism groaning in protest. Jacob took a step back, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give him away. The door creaked open, just a fraction, and the darkness beyond seemed to spill into the room like a living thing, filling the space with an oppressive sense of dread. Jacob raised the rifle, aiming it at the narrow gap in the door, his finger hovering over the trigger. His mouth was dry, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his ears. The door opened wider, and for a moment, all he could see was darkness, thick, impenetrable, and suffocating. And then he saw it, a single, glowing eye, peering out from the shadows. It was not an eye of flesh and blood, but something else entirely, something that burned with an unnatural light, a sickly green glow that seemed to sear itself into Jacob's mind. The eye was followed by another, and then a third, until the darkness was filled with the glowing orbs, all staring directly at him, filled with a hunger that was all too real. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. This was no ordinary creature, no man twisted by some dark magic. This was something far older, far more malevolent than anything he could have imagined. The growl came again, low and menacing, vibrating through the walls and floor. The eyes moved closer, the shadows parting to reveal the twisted form of the figure that haunted the fog. It was taller than he had imagined, its limbs long and sinewy, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers that seemed to glisten with a wet, red sheen. Its mouth was a gaping maw of jagged teeth, dripping with the blood of its previous victims, and from deep within its throat came a sound that was almost like laughter, cruel, mocking, and filled with the promise of pain. Jacob's mind screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but his body refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so intense it threatened to consume him. The figure moved closer, its glowing eyes never leaving his, as if it were savoring the terror that radiated from him in waves. And then, with a speed that defied reason, it lunged. Jacob barely had time to react. He squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucking in his hands as the shot rang out, deafening in the small room. The figure jerked back, its body contorting in ways that no living thing should be able to. But the shot did not stop it. Instead, it only seemed to enrage the creature further. With a howl of fury, the figure lashed out, its claws slicing through the air with a speed and precision that left Jacob no time to react. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as the claws tore through flesh and bone, and then he was falling, the world spinning around him in a blur of pain and fear. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor out of reach. He tried to crawl away, to put distance between himself and the creature, but it was no use. The figure was on him in an instant, its weight pressing down on him like a vice, its glowing eyes boring into his with a hatred that was palpable. Jacob could feel the life draining from him, his vision dimming as the darkness closed in. The figure leaned in closer, its breath hot and foul against his skin, its mouth opening wide as if to devour him whole. And then, just as he was about to be consumed by the darkness, the whistle sounded again, louder this time, more insistent, as if it were calling the creature away. The figure hesitated, its eyes flicking towards the sound, and at that moment, Jacob knew he had a chance. With the last of his strength, he reached out, his fingers closing around the handle of the fireplace poker that lay just inches away. With a cry of desperation, he swung the poker with all his might, striking the creature across the head. The figure let out a roar of pain and fury, rearing back as the blow connected. It staggered, its form flickering like a shadow caught in the wind, and for a moment, Jacob thought he might have a chance to escape. But the creature was not so easily defeated. With a snarl, it lunged at him again, its claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. Jacob braced himself for the end, knowing that there was no escape from the horror that had come for him. But then, the whistle sounded once more, and this time, the creature recoiled, as if the sound itself was causing it pain. It let out a howl of rage, its form flickering and distorting as the whistle grew louder, more insistent. Jacob watched in disbelief as the figure began to dissolve, its body unraveling into the fog that had brought it into existence. The glowing eyes flickered and faded, and the darkness that had filled the room began to lift, leaving behind only the lingering scent of blood and fear. The whistle continued to sound, its mournful cry echoing through the night, and as the last remnants of the creature disappeared into the fog, Jacob felt the weight of the night lift from his chest. He was alive, but only barely. With trembling hands, he pushed himself up from the floor, his body aching from the ordeal. He stumbled towards the door, his mind numb with shock and disbelief. He had survived the night, but he knew that the horror was far from over. The whistle had saved him, but its mournful cry was a double-edged sword. As Jacob stumbled out into the fog-drenched streets, he knew the reprieve it granted was temporary. The curse of Black Hollow was far from over, and the midnight whistle was merely the prelude to a cycle of torment that would never end. The fog clung to him like a shroud, cold and damp, chilling him to the bone as he made his way down the desolate street. The town, once filled with the sounds of life, was now deathly silent, save for the distant echo of the whistle that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was as if the town itself was watching, waiting for the next move in this macabre game. Jacob's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The creature, no, the abomination, had been something beyond his understanding, something that defied the very laws of nature. But what haunted him more than the creature's grotesque form was the realization that the whistle, the very thing that had kept him alive, was somehow connected to it. As he reached the town square, the heart of Black Hollow, Jacob's steps faltered. The once vibrant square was now a barren, lifeless expanse, the cobblestones cracked and overgrown with weeds. In the center stood the ancient tree where the man, no, the monster, had been hanged so many years ago. Its gnarled branches twisted upward like skeletal fingers, reaching out to the sky in a silent plea for release. At the base of the tree, half buried in the dirt, was the whistle. Jacob stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. The small, silver object seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its surface gleaming even in the dim light of the fog-covered moon. It was the source of the curse, the key to the nightmare that had plagued Black Hollow for generations. He knew what he had to do. With trembling hands, Jacob reached down and picked up the whistle. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver through his entire body. For a moment, he stood there, the weight of the object heavy in his palm, the enormity of his decision pressing down on him. He could destroy it, crush it underfoot, throw it into the fire, anything to rid the town of its cursed presence. But deep down, Jacob knew it wasn't that simple. The whistle was more than just an object. It was a conduit, a channel through which the darkness of Black Hollow flowed. Destroying it might end the curse, but it might also unleash something far worse. The thought of facing that unknown terror was almost too much to bear. But Jacob had seen too much, endured too much, to turn back now. He was the last of the town's inhabitants who had the strength, or the foolishness, to face the curse head-on. Taking a deep breath, he put the whistle to his lips. The metal was icy against his skin, the taste of it bitter and metallic. His hand shook, but he forced himself to steady it. He knew that once he blew the whistle, there would be no turning back. Whatever was bound to it would be summoned, and he would have to face it, whatever it was. With a final, resolute breath, Jacob blew the whistle. The sound that emerged was unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was not the mournful cry that had haunted the town for so long, but something deeper, more primal. It was a sound that seemed to reach into the very soul of Black Hollow, stirring something ancient and malevolent that had long been dormant. The fog thickened, swirling around Jacob with a new intensity. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, until he could no longer see the surrounding town. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the void, leaving him alone in the darkness. And then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the silence like the tolling of a death knell. Jacob turned, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing to see, only the endless fog that seemed to stretch on forever. The footsteps grew closer, the sound of them heavy and relentless, as if something was coming for him from the very depths of the earth. Jacob backed away, his mind racing with fear and desperation, but there was nowhere to go. The fog pressed in on him from all sides, trapping him in a world of shadows and terror. And then, out of the fog, it appeared. The figure was not the same as before. It was taller, its form more defined, more solid, as if the act of summoning it had given it a new strength. Its eyes still glowed with that sickly green light, but now there was something else in them. An intelligence, a cold, calculating awareness that made Jacob's skin crawl. The figure took another step forward, its footfalls echoing through the void. It reached out a hand, its long, clawed fingers extending towards Jacob with a slow, deliberate motion. The surrounding air seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, a palpable sense of malice that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. Jacob wanted to run, to flee into the darkness and never look back, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, rooted to the spot by a terror so deep it felt as if his very soul was being pulled into the abyss. The figure's hand closed around the whistle in Jacob's hand, its grip like iron. For a moment, the two stood there, locked in a silent struggle, the weight of the curse pressing down on them both. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, the figure ripped the whistle from Jacob's grasp. The sound that followed was like nothing Jacob had ever heard before. It was a scream, a howl of pure, unadulterated rage that shook the very foundations of the town. The fog roiled and churned, the air crackling with dark energy as the figure raised the whistle to its own lips. Jacob's eyes widened in horror as the figure blew the whistle, the sound that emerged a twisted, corrupted version of the one he had made. It was a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself, a sound that brought with it the weight of all the pain, all the suffering that had ever been inflicted on Black Hollow. The ground beneath Jacob's feet began to tremble, the very earth shaking as the curse that had plagued the town for so long was unleashed in its full fury. The fog thickened, enveloping him in a darkness so complete it was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the void. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The fog lifted, the darkness receded, and Jacob found himself standing in the middle of the town square, the whistle gone from his hand, the figure nowhere to be seen. The town was silent once more, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. The ancient tree in the center of the square stood tall and imposing, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Jacob took a shaky breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. The curse was gone. He could feel it in the air, in the very ground beneath his feet. Black Hollow was free. But as he turned to leave, a new sound reached his ears, a soft, almost imperceptible whistle, drifting through the night air like the call of a siren. Jacob froze, his blood running cold. The whistle was not gone. It had merely found a new host. And as the sound grew louder, more insistent, Jacob knew that the curse of Black Hollow would never truly be broken. It would live on, in the shadows, in the fog, in the hearts of those who had been touched by its darkness. And as the whistle sounded again, its mournful cry echoing through the empty streets, Jacob knew that his time was running out. The hunt had begun once more, and this time there would be no escape.